Hello, and welcome to our panel here, Loblaw's Companies and Corporate Fleets Go Electric. You know, this is one of the most fascinating stories I have seen on corporate EV transformation to date. And I'm really excited to have these two panelists here. Rebecca from Loblaw's.
Yes.
Please.
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Rebecca Moorey. I'm the Senior Manager of Fleet and National Programs with Loblaw Companies and Shoppers Drug Mart. I manage the corporate fleet of about 1,200 vehicles across Canada and also a small fleet for our Loblaw Produce International Department in the United States. Looking forward to discussing this today.
Yeah, very cool, and thank you for coming. It's great to have you here. Avninder, it's good to see you here today.
Thanks so much.
Tell us a little bit about Element.
Sure, yeah. So Element is a global fleet manager based in Toronto and listed on the TSX. We manage about 1.5 million vehicles across the markets we operate in, and we operate globally in a global alliance with Arval, which is a BNP Paribas subsidiary. My role at Element is head of electrification, so I lead everything related to product development and strategy related to our electrification programs. I also lead everything related to our client engagement, including my team supports Rebecca and Loblaw in their EV rollout. So looking forward to the conversation today.
Good, thank you. And my name is James Carter. I'm Principal Consultant of Vision Mobility, and I'm based here in Toronto as well. And you know, going back to what I was talking about, this being an exciting story, Rebecca, please tell us a little bit about what were some of the overarching goals that Loblaw's had for transitioning the fleet to EV? How did it come about? You know, what were the really key drivers that really developed that?
This came about when Loblaw announced their net zero plans to assist with climate change. And that was just the natural, transition for my area to transition the corporate fleet, which has always been primarily ICE vehicles, to electric. And that started in 2022, again, right in the middle of the pandemic. So that created a bit of an issue in itself, a bit of complexity. And then it proceeded with, okay, how are we going to approach this? What are we going to do? And that led to a natural conversation with Element about what are our next steps here? What are best practices? What should we be doing? What should we be looking at? What should we be considering? The key drivers for this, like I said, were, EV readiness and getting engagement and buy-in from the business. For, ensuring that senior leadership bought into this and supported it, and also having a very positive driver experience. That was key to all of this.
I'm really curious about this senior management bit. How did you get buy-in? Was that driven top down? Did you have to push it up top? How did that whole corporate decision-making thing
We
happen?
initially started by looking at, okay, again, speaking with Element about what are our options here, what should we be doing? Conversation came up about the pilot. And then initially the business was, okay, well, should we be doing it with our executive fleet? No, we didn't want to do it with our executive fleet. We wanted it to be our drivers that are on the road doing high kilometers and understanding what those drivers. If we did the executives, we didn't think we'd get a full picture and understanding of really how the vehicles were performing, how they were across all our different regions in Canada. So that was part of it, but also part of the buy-in on the executives was it came from the top, that we expected our executive population to support this, and for their fleet vehicles as well, transition them to electric over a period of time, but it wasn't in a pilot situation. It was just, here's your selectors of ICE and here's your EV selectors. But the expectation is if you can do EVs, we want you to be in an EV and we want you to lead the way. And that's really was key to progressing this, was getting the executive population, the senior leadership to buy into it.
And James, sorry, if I could just maybe add one thing to that as well. And I think Loblaw was a great example of leadership in this space because it really reflects one of the key success factors as it relates to how fleets can electrify. The reality is electrification is more than just swapping out an ICE vehicle for an EV. There's a lot of work that needs to go in from a change management perspective, from understanding charging and infrastructure, energy management, obviously managing the cost differentials as they exist today. And so having that top-down support helps to navigate some of those friction points within organizations. And I think one of the key things that makes it really work is ensuring that not only do you have that buy-in, but when you bring that from a top down and you align to corporate objectives, it's really then getting the grassroots, getting the drivers that are in the vehicles bought into it as early champions.
Right, and if I understand the process, and maybe I'm going to jump down to the second question here. How did Element look at supporting Loblaw's through the process, and what did the pilot process and readiness checks look like? And I'm guessing I'm coming from that because we've had this directive from Loblaw's, and Element's come in and said, okay, this is how we're going to support, this is how we're going to feed the information back up to the senior management to, I guess, as a verification check. What did that look like?
Yeah, so it's, and good segue from what I was mentioning before, change management is so key to this whole thing, and so where our process really starts is understanding our clients, in this case, Loblaw's corporate objectives, right? What were the sustainability targets? What was really driving the initiative? Is it based on legislation? In some markets, that's the case. In other cases, and I would say most cases, it's driven by corporate sustainability objectives. And that's one of the things that's created some staying power when you compare it to the consumer market, where you have seen some slowdowns in the last little while as some of the macroeconomic factors come into play. So the process that we take is first understanding what the corporate objectives are, and then actually working through feasibility analysis using data, telematics where available, fuel data where available, to really evaluate a fleet and understand what their operating patterns are, what does range look like. Obviously weather has an impact on range, so understanding where the vehicles are actually located becomes important. Once we've got that, then we actually look at overall what does it take to actually electrify a fleet over time. As I mentioned, you're going to have a mixed ICE and EV fleet for an extended period of time, and so understanding the dynamics of that, and that's where Element, from our perspective, it was important for us not to stand up a completely separate EV entity that focused on maintenance and ordering for EVs only, but really integrating that into our overall business. And so from that roadmap, that's where we can actually start to develop some early engagement or rollouts plans for the initial pilots. We engage with drivers. In this particular case, it's home-based fleets. And so thinking about deployment of charging infrastructure in a home becomes an important factor. And then obviously, when you're measuring the pilot and reporting back against it, that's how you kind of keep the executive team aligned.
And so actually, let's segue again a little bit further for both of you. I'm going to start with Avninder here, but how did you grab all that and then say, okay, this is the pilot that we're going to do? What did that pilot look like? Obviously we had some goals in mind, but tell me about how you set it up, and then Rebecca, please add what happened. I'd be really fascinated to find a bit more out here.
Yeah, I think when you think about what is early electrification pilots, what's the objective of them? It's really about getting organizations ready for scale.
Right.
And right now, as it exists in the market, there's a lot of macroeconomic considerations, as I mentioned, that prevent scale from happening quickly, and that is, vehicles are more expensive than their ICE counterparts because the battery technology obviously hasn't progressed as far as it needs to bring that price to parity. Charging infrastructure is complicated, range anxiety continues to exist for drivers, and so for us, those are all key parts of readiness as we think about how organizations are going to electrify their fleets. Part of that readiness is also ensuring that we've got the right charging systems and programs in place, the right driver policies. When we think about driver energy reimbursement in a home, do we have the right programs in place for that? And so it's really making sure that all of those things are ticked and tied. And so as we design the pilot, we really set the pilot metrics around each of those areas so that as we progress through the pilot, we can mark, do we feel like we've made it to a point where this is ready, or do we feel like we need to go through another cycle to make sure that we get reimbursement right, or did we allocate enough dollars for the actual charging infrastructure deployment, or do we need to increase it or maybe decrease it depending on corporate plans. So those are all critical factors, not just in the planning of pilots, but in measuring them over the course of the process.
So let's jump now. That's amazing setup on how to
Yeah.
work through the pilot. So
Yeah.
let's jump now into how did the pilot actually go?
So the pilots went great. We did our first pilot, like I said, late 2022. Again, the EV options were few, and one of the key drivers or the key important for this group, this population, is range. Again, these were drivers on the road a lot, doing high kilometers, could be in any community across the country. We have stores everywhere, and high mileage drivers.
What sort of mileage are they doing a year? Is it?
We're typically doing probably at least 30 to 50, 60,000 kilometers a year.
That's big mileage. And I
So,
think that
yeah.
the key thing is like, how do you make EVs work
Yeah.
in such a high mileage? Oh, but
Yeah.
but let's.
So we, and I was going to the business asking to spend more money than we typically would because the EV options we had at the time were limited. And then, looking at, okay, let's do a pilot of 25. Eventually did get the business buy-in, the business support again from the top. We also engaged our Loblaw energy team. We have an energy team, and we specifically utilized several drivers in that team that we used as champions so that they could speak to the other drivers in the pilot to provide assistance, provide support. We conducted regular touch points with these drivers to address any concerns, questions, hesitations. I mean, the initial pilot, there was a lot of excitement, a lot of anticipation. Overall, it went quite well. We had very few, no major issues really. Home installation was, we were on budget. We took it from a perspective for the EV chargers, and the home installation was an approach of an average versus looking at the cost individually.
Right.
That allowed us to continue unimpeded and then not disqualify anyone from the project.
Great.
So overall, the first pilot was great. The second pilot,
Before I go
Yeah,
any further,
sure.
I want to just point out some key learnings from that I think is really important from here. And I think the first one we can say was choose the right vehicle.
Yeah.
Make
Yeah.
sure if you've got high mileage drivers, pick a vehicle with long range.
Yeah.
So I think that's the first one.
that was key also because we knew that if the pilot was not successful, that would really kill it with senior management.
Right.
I knew that I had to get a positive experience here right from the start for everyone.
Yep.
And then that assisted with the additional buy-in of the business going, yeah, you are doing the right thing.
Yep.
The surveys we did with the driver pilots were all averages between 4 plus out of 5.
That's
So
excellent.
we knew that we were on the right track. We knew we had the right vehicles and the support for the drivers. And the support being myself, other drivers, but also Element. So that Element's team could, if there were concerns about charging, or questions about public charging, it was all handled very well.
It seems like, the other learning here is take this kind of macro view on it.
Yes,
So
yes.
while it's empowered from the top, but also in this next layer, we can say like, let's do it right. Let's get the right cars.
Yeah.
Let's get the right charging so that it all operates. Let's not skimp on this. Let's do it right.
If we had skimped on it, we wouldn't have gotten the same result.
Right.
I knew that. And in our particular business, the culture of the business and again, getting that buy-in from senior management, but also making sure that these colleagues, it did not impede their day-to-day job function. That was really key, because if drivers were coming back saying, well, I can't do my job right,
You're all
well
over.
then we're not successful here. We're not doing what we should be doing. But we didn't get any of that.
And I think a good, and again, Loblaw is a great example of this, a good lesson that we've learned, maybe a little anecdotally, but a good lesson that we've learned is typically when you get a driver into an EV, they don't want to go back to an ICE vehicle. Now there's exceptions. If you get a driver into an EV and they have to stop 2 times a day to use a public charger, they're going to have massive operational impact and they're gonna look to say maybe this wasn't a success for me. But because EVs typically tend to have newer technology, the performance is better, they're newer vehicles in general, it is a really positive driving experience.
Yeah.
The hardest part in this whole process is actually getting them over the hump of wanting to try an EV and convincing them, and that's where managing the range anxiety becomes really important.
Right.
And I mentioned the operational impact of public charging. Public charging is an absolute necessity to manage people's range anxiety. But we've seen this, and statistically this is pretty consistent across different markets. 80% of charging is going to happen in private settings, whether that's a depot, whether that's a home. And so making sure you find the right fit for use vehicle that's got the right appropriate range, not just the rated range, but also the range in the actual operations.
Right.
So when you start to think about vehicles operating in northern Alberta, you've got to give it a range haircut. And we factor that into the analysis that we do. And that becomes even more important as you start to think about service-oriented vehicles, which not the case in this particular pilot, but as you think about service-oriented vehicles where you're adding 1,000 pounds of racking in the back or other upfit, maybe a refrigeration unit, those are all going to have material impact. So those things need to be tested out through the process of piloting.
So I think there's one really important factor here, and that was understanding that 80% of the charging happens at home. And so by doing that, I think the other important thing that you both were able to work out really well is to say, okay, these employees who are going to have these cars, we're going to put these chargers in at home, we're going to have the budget for them to make sure it works, because we know that's where they're going to charge.
And that was our message to the drivers, was we expect you to do the vast majority of your charging at home.
Right.
We paid for the charger install, we paid for the charger itself, but again, we kept on budget. At the end of the average, we were exactly where we needed to be, and awesome. There was very few hiccups from a charging standpoint.
That's excellent.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And I think hearing these positive experiences about planning it right, budgeting it right, making sure it happened, the end result is a positive experience for the driver and for the company as well. So if you go back and try to skimp, as we talked about before, things start to fail. And I think that's a really, really important thing. Now, I want to segue a little bit further. What were the challenges for the drivers that you heard?
What I've heard thus far is similar to what Avninder has said. It's about change management.
Right.
It's about, they're in an ICE vehicle typically, and they're not thinking. They get up and they start driving for their day, and they could be in various stores, various DCs, various customers, and they're not really thinking about, okay, well, I got to fill up with gas, no problem. It was the change in mindset. It was thinking about their day, planning their day, how do I do that? But again, talking it through with the touch points helped. Having champions internally from our energy team also helped. Having assistance from Elements team available, whether it be the maintenance team, whether it be Reed assisting with questions. It was very supportive environment.
Awesome.
So that was it's really the change management. The other piece is range too, as I've mentioned,
Right.
is that was key, is that these are high mileage drivers. We need as much range as possible.
I want to pick up a little bit about these champions from the energy side that you talked about.
Yeah.
Take me through a little bit about what they did. How did they influence the rest of the drivers?
It was based on our touch points. We would have bi-weekly touch points.
Really?
And we also asked these pilot participants, you need to be an active, engaged participant. We're not going to be giving you an EV and expect you to never hear from you and to never tell us both good and bad. We want to hear from you, and you have to commit to that. So having semi-regular touch points, or even calling us or emailing us at any time, those champions and Element to address anything from charging questions, vehicle questions, this is what I'm experiencing, what are you experiencing? It was that support from across the board that really helped drivers, and that really took it to the next step, and they didn't feel hesitant or uneasy.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
And It sounds like there was some collaboration amongst
Yes.
the drivers. You know,
Yes.
you
Oh,
talked about the
definitely.
bi-weekly
Yes.
meeting, and they were comparing notes. I'm getting whatever.
And they were even talking about, well, I'm charging it overnight at this time, and oh, I'm charging it at this time, and they compare the rates. And
Right,
they would,
right.
You know, so it was all about collaboration.
Very cool. It sounds like there was almost a bit of a, not a club, but
A network.
A network
Yeah.
in the team to really, almost a bit of an exciting thing, I would
Yeah.
say.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think support across the board is that important point, right? Is that there's
Right.
going to be multiple touch points. So supporting the Loblaw team is not just my EV team, but to Rebecca's point, there's touch points with our maintenance team, with our ordering team, our accounts team, and so for us, it was really important that those questions didn't come in and then just get funneled to us, but seeding that EV information throughout the organization where, again, the predominant number of vehicles are still ICE vehicles, but focusing on that EV training to make sure that there's people that are able to understand and be able to articulate answers for clients as they're calling in, but also to champion. So one of the things that we did in parallel, actually with Rebecca's pilots, is we rolled out EVs to our internal drivers as well.
Oh, very neat.
And so similar to the feedback that Rebecca got, we get positive and very constructive, I think is the right way to say it, feedback from our drivers. Some of them are in the crowd here today, I won't point them out. But all of that is so important because we're at such an early stage of maturity that understanding where the gaps are in charging, in reimbursement, in vehicle selection, in range. Without that information, it's really hard to plan for what does a scaled rollout look like when you start talking moving from 25 or 50 vehicles to hundreds or thousands of vehicles.
So let's pick up something here. I think it's really important. EV driver training. I know you both touched on it, but perhaps if you can both elaborate on what some of those key things that you would say when you're talking to other companies, particularly for you, Avninder, what are those other companies you say, okay, these are these things, A, B, C, D, that you've got to talk to your drivers about, you've got to plan for. Maybe we'll start with Rebecca.
And again, we did it with Ellen. We have another EV training session coming up this Friday for the next pilot, next round of vehicles. We approached it really from the basics, saying, here's about the vehicle you're going to get, highlighting what the features are, what to expect, even what to expect at delivery, what to expect from a home charging perspective, what to expect from a monthly stipend for reimbursement for home charging. Here's here's resources you can go to find out about public charging, infrastructure, and then a Q&A session. It was typically about an hour long, and we just basically go from point A to everything in between, whether it be the vehicle, the experience, the charging, the stipend, any other tax questions, anything related to the vehicle itself and the process.
Very cool. And when you offered, was this an opt-in process for the particular drivers, or was this
This was mandatory.
It was mandatory.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow. Yeah. So it was really a driving.
Yeah. We even had them acknowledge at the start when they accepted entry into the pilot, was they signed that they would commit to being engaged and give us feedback, because this is what we're doing the pilot for.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I would consider that a best practice, right? Like what Rebecca's describing here and her champion of this within the organization and making sure that the drivers were completing the training is such a key success factor because the vehicles are different, right?
Yeah.
Delivery processes, depending on the OEM, are different. Charging is something, you've never had to train somebody to fill up gas in a tank, except for when they learned how to drive.
Right.
This is the same thing. Imagine when you were 16 years old and learning to drive and your parents or whoever taught you to drive took you to a gas station and helped you understand the safe way to fill up your gas tank. This is the exact same thing. It's just happening at different stages now. And so understanding how to charge, but not just use a charger, but use a charger effectively. What the impact of frequent fast charging is, what happens if you charge at 6 p.m. versus 2 a.m., how to think about time of use charges, and there is some best practices that are there, and so we use that initial training as an opportunity to be able to relay some of those messages, but we keep the communication lines open, knowing that there's going to be things that come up throughout the course of the pilot.
So I think this section here, I think we could really summarize the best practice here as driver training initially when they get the car, and driver feedback once they have the car.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
We did surveys at several different points in the pilot, shortly, 2-3 months after, but then we also did a survey during the colder months. We wanted to compare the responses between the two different timings of the survey. And surprisingly, for the first pilot, it really, in terms of the rates or the overall score, it really wasn't that different,
Really?
surprisingly.
Between summer and winter?
Yeah, which
Really?
was a little, we didn't necessarily expect that. But that was also my tool to provide to the business to say, hey, look, this is working.
Yeah,
This is
yeah.
doing what it's supposed to do. We've picked the right vehicles, and we're getting success from the based on the driver's response.
And it meant that they were charging at home like they were supposed
Correct.
to.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
100%. And going on from that, once you gathered this information about the success that you're having or the results that you were having on the EV pilot, what did senior management say when you said, hey, look, this is what we did, these are the key things
They
that
gave
we
us approval for the second pilot.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand, I think, that the objectives for organizations is about successful pilots. They all, and when we talk about EV pilots, we're really talking about emission reduction, right? So organizations, they typically, even if they have an electrification target, it's really a manifestation of a broader emissions reduction target. And so any win that organizations can speak to about that, whether it's internally from a championing perspective or whether it's externally from a reporting perspective, is net positive for them. So whenever we can take successful pilots to leadership, it's generally a pretty positive response.
And when the business approached me on this there was an urgency to it. Like they expected results, and they wanted to see action on this. It wasn't, oh, well, okay, well, you're thinking about this and let us know what you think. It was like, no, you
Go.
go,
Yeah.
go. You need to make this happen. So, and that's sort of what drove everything as well, is just getting Element and just forging ahead.
And James, one of the things I think, adding on to what Rebecca's saying here, that I think is important to remember as we think about emissions reductions and meeting some of those targets, swapping over a fleet overnight into electric vehicles is a recipe for disaster, right? So making sure you get through readiness, but that doesn't mean that there isn't other levers that you can pull. So as you look at the spectrum of low emission or zero emission vehicles that exist out there, thinking about what the right mix is one of the ways of doing it. Thinking about and using emissions reductions as a way to think about how big does your fleet actually need to be, and thinking about fleet rationalization. The only thing better than a zero emission vehicle is no vehicle, right? So if you can remove a vehicle, it's even better. Thinking about idle reduction. Not only do you get a cost benefit from reducing the amount of fuel consumed, but you also get a greenhouse gas reduction as well. And so these are all levers that organizations can pull as they think about emissions reduction as a whole, and they're all supportive of a fully electric vehicle rollout because they bolster some of those emission reduction targets in the near term while you work through those initial pilots.
Very cool. Now, I think you're in the second pilot right now.
Yes.
How's that going, and what's next? What's next for Loblaw's? Is this a complete fleet rollout? How does this look?
For our second pilot, when we approached colleagues about it, there were some that were still very excited and wanted to participate. We did get some hesitancy and a little bit of and honestly just nervousness. How is this going to impact my job? Is it going to affect my role? Or I'm not sure. I'm driving in Northern Ontario or I'm in Northern Alberta. I'm not comfortable. If there was anyone like that, there was just a few. We did remove them. We found replacements easily, not a problem. We're about in the middle of the pilot now. Not all vehicles have delivered yet. We've still got a few yet to come. But then again, surveying, keeping touch points with those drivers, hopefully getting the same. We're on the path, we're seeing that it's being successful as well. We've added a few more options for the second pilot versus the first.
Vehicle options.
Vehicle options. The first pilot was just a couple of EVs. The second pilot, we're getting a little bit more broader. Next steps is, from what Avninder is saying, is EV readiness. Are we ready to take it to the next step? And that means moving away from a pilot and potentially general rollout for those drivers. We're starting to look at other EV options and what the life cycle analysis is and what the pricing looks and what the costing, and it's looking positive.
Excellent.
So that is what we anticipate to be next steps.
That's fantastic. And so we talked a little bit about that, but let's think about this jump from the pilot. I think the first was 25 and the second was 25 as well.
Yeah.
So there's 1,200 in the corporate fleet,
Yeah.
and maybe not all of them
Yeah.
can really go full EV just yet. But, you know, we're looking at a much greater rollout
Yeah.
from this pilot. What are those challenges now? What do we have to get past now to get into this?
We're taking a curved approach. So we started out, our goal in 2023 was 50 vehicles. We surpassed that. This year it's 100 vehicles. We're very close to already meeting that, so we expect to surpass that as well. Numbers are going to ramp up pretty quickly in the next 2-3 years. So it will mean aggressive, but we'll probably start out slow with these ones, even if it's 25 or 50 vehicles.
Yep.
Again, keeping our target and ensuring we're meeting our goal, basically.
And James, one point to add there to remember is commercial fleets don't cycle every year.
Right.
So there's typically, depending on the organization, 3 to 6 year cycle time average, let's call it 4 or 5 years. So over that period of time, if you've bought something in 2024, you're not cycling it until 2028 or 2029.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so that's, as you think about what the actual transition timeline looks like, that's why the roadmap becomes so important, because you're factoring in what that actual cycle time is. And so it's not I've got 1,200 vehicles today, how do I get to 1,200 vehicles tomorrow? It's really thinking about what that natural cycle is and how can you look at meeting that cycle, but also accelerating in certain areas.
Right, because there's some replacements that has to come
That's
back
right,
into the
that's
fleet.
right. And to Rebecca's point, the hesitation from the second tranche of drivers is very, very natural right now. I think if you went back 5 years, there would be no consumer drivers that would have any opinions about commercial fleets. I think it's almost impossible to read the news today and not see something related to mobility, whether that's electrification, whether that's charging, whether that's anything else that's happening. And so all of those things factor into how drivers' perception of a potential electrification of their fleet looks like. And so as we think about driver training, as we think about advocacy, as we think about all the things that we need to do to get people on board, we've got to factor all those things in. And so naturally, bringing people along for the ride, helping them to understand the difference between consumer and commercial transition becomes really important.
And when we started thinking, okay, 2030 was our date, we sat down and mapped it out to say, okay, what is realistic in terms of, it'll be aggressive, but how do we get to that point? And that has helped us as well to really have a target in mind and to be able to meet it or surpass it.
So in other words, and I think this is really important for everyone here too, is you set a target. You said, okay, it's 2030, we're going to do it, and then you almost did a work back schedule.
We did 2030, and then, and then Element's recommendation was start slow, but then curve up. But then as we get towards that end goal, start coming back down.
Interesting.
And I think one of the things that I love about working with Rebecca is when we set that target and we did that plan, her question when we came to the point that said we may have some friction points here, she said, don't tell me about the friction points, tell me what it'll take to overcome the friction points.
Right.
And to really make sure that not only do we meet but exceed some of those expectations. So to me, I think that is true stewardship and leadership.
Yeah, 100%. And it's really, what I find really fascinating is how you both work together to come up with the right plan to make sure that this whole thing worked out really well, that senior management were happy, that drivers were happy. It was, to me, this is almost like a best case scenario that I've seen of companies and fleet companies working together to really make this transition very successful. So I think now we're going to transition into the Q&A. So we do have 3 microphones, one there, one there, one there. So if you have some questions, please come up and ask us and let us know. So Stephen's already here, please shoot.
All right, thanks, James. It's just Stephen Beatty with EV Society here. Just a question, I'm thinking about the audience here from the perspective of an EV owner or driver in this fleet of vehicles that Loblaw has. the plug that you would have installed in the garage, was it like a NEMA plug so that the charger was detachable and at the end of the test pilot phase? Like, and how long was your test pilot phase? Just trying to think about, when the pilot's done, was it after a year, let's say? Did you have the charger removed from the wall in the garage and then brought back to your office, or was it a permanently hardwired level 2 charger at the home?
It was hardwired. We're expecting the pilot, to Avninder's point, to be the length of the replacement cycle of the vehicle.
Yeah.
So whether that be 4 or 5 years, possibly 5. But no, that the pilot will continue, the driver will stay in that vehicle, assuming the driver is still in a role that requires a fleet vehicle. Then at the time of vehicle replacement, then we would transition the colleague to the next EV, but that would not be a pilot phase, and then the pilot would end ultimately.
Yeah, and the only thing that I would add to that is the hardwired versus the NEMA plug consideration was the NEMA plug would be way easier in general in life. The challenge that we run into is that with the electrical code changing in so many jurisdictions that require GFI outlets, the potential for tripping that and then needing to engage with the driver to reset it because they don't know exactly what happened was creating a lot of challenges. So it's safer to do the hard wiring. And then to Rebecca's point, the monitoring phase of the pilot will be considerably shorter, but the drivers stay in the vehicles over the course of that vehicle life cycle.
And was there real-time monitoring of the data, like were they Wi-Fi enabled chargers?
Correct, yeah. So one of the positions that at least Element's taken, and Loblaw was very supportive of this as well, is there's no point in not putting a smart charger into the home because monitoring that data becomes important for things like reimbursement, for understanding whether the charger is up or down. So if you see a driver, for whatever reason, they start submitting public charging charges in for reimbursement, you can start to understand, is that because their charger at home isn't working? So these things all become really important as part of the monitoring process.
Excellent, thank you.
Thanks.
Down here, number 11.
Hi, Doug Parker with Arcadis. One of my questions was how the home charging works. I think all that was just answered. My other question was whether there's any charging being installed in the loading docks at the stores.
That would be...
Or eventually.
Yeah, more than likely. Again, that would be part of our the Loblaw Energy team. They are looking at all opportunities across all of our stores and DCs and real estate that we have for energy options. So that I can't speak to it specifically, but more than likely, yes.
Okay. Dave, down here, number 9.
Dave Schaller with NACFE. Thank you for all the great lessons learned. I know just recently here at Truck World, Loblaw had both a Class 8 e-Cascadia electric semi and a hydrogen fuel cell semi. I'm curious, I don't think you ever mentioned the types of vehicles that were in your initial pilots. What types of vehicles were they, and how does this work transition into larger commercial vehicles?
Okay, in terms of the corporate fleet, for the first pilot, Tesla, the Tesla Model Y, Tesla 3, and Ford Mach-E. On the second pilot, those vehicles, along with the Chevy Blazer, the Volvo XC40 Recharge, and the Audi Q4 e-tron.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
David.
Yeah, sounds like great pilot. My name is David Staniford. I do small fleet consulting to help electrify, so obviously a big fan of what you guys are doing. I'm just curious, you mentioned, Rebecca, there was initially a higher cost. You had to go back. Obviously, the vehicles are a little more expensive.
Yeah.
But I'm curious to know, from a total cost of ownership, given the operational savings, what does it look like over the life cycle? Are you already seeing savings on that front?
Yeah, I mean, when we started looking at the analysis, again, those vehicles at the time, that was really our only option. Looking at the life cycle analysis of when that cost parity may come up between an ICE and an EV, hopefully we'll see it at, the 3, 4, 5 year mark, but then we'll probably be, depending upon the mileage of the driver, replacing the vehicle after about 4 or 5 years. Going forward, once we do transition out of the pilots, I am hoping that we will be able to transition away to vehicles that would be more typical for these types of drivers, not necessarily those that I've mentioned before, but something a little bit more mid-market, mid-level.
Yeah. The one thing I would add to that as well is TCO is an interesting measure, and it's the most important measure as fleets think about their transition period. But typically, when you look at a lot of the public-facing TCO analysis that's done, it's looking at MSRP as a starting point.
Yeah.
But for commercial fleets, because of the volume of purchasing that they're doing, there's typically discounting that they're getting, and depending on the relationships with OEMs, it may be within certain vehicle models. And so if you look at something that may have a similar MSRP, but with one OEM, because of their relationship with the client, they may have a much deeper discount. Those TCOs aren't going to be equivalent. And so we've got a strategic advisory team that work really closely with Rebecca and our other clients, where when we do TCO analysis, we're factoring that in. So when we're looking at their actual cost versus that MSRP cost, and that's where in certain vehicle classes, publicly, right, you may have TCO parity existing today for certain use cases. For commercial fleets, when you actually look at the numbers associated, it may be still a little bit further away.
And remember, the goal here with this pilot was GHG. I mean, it was, that's key too.
Yeah, I think the whole thing here was
Yeah.
a slightly broader picture, because it wasn't just about TCO, it was about
Correct.
ESG, it was about really gaining the company's
That was
buy-in,
really
and
what
that
was
were the,
driving
that were the
this.
most
We
important.
wouldn't typically do that.
Right.
You know, this was, if we want to do something, if we want to work towards our GHG goals, this is the path we have to take right now.
And we've got to invest in it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
We've got time for one more question over here.
Hello. Oh, there we go. Excellent presentation. Really enjoyed the lessons learned and talking about especially pioneering some of the home charging solutions. And what I hear with other fleet colleagues and some of the challenges we face and talk about is around the policies and the agreements with those staff who have the home chargers. So things like, can they use those home chargers for their own personal vehicles? Who's doing the maintenance on those home chargers when they go down? What happens if an employee moves? Location where the employee lives and how close it is to their work, and things like taxable benefits. Wondering if you can talk a little bit about some of those policy and or agreements that were put in place.
Yeah, again, that was part of the pilot, was coming up with driver communications and policy, and I did develop an EV policy in collaboration with Element, basically working off of our ICE policy, but quite a few changes and adapted. In terms of the chargers themselves, we did put some language in about if the colleague were to leave, whether it be voluntary, involuntary, after a period of time. In terms of if the charger needed repairs or servicing, the costs would most likely be picked up by the business. I don't even know if we really even touched on that, to be frank. But we have that, and it's been developed, and it's gone over well. From a taxable benefit perspective, we haven't made any adjustments on that side of it, because nothing has been done by the CRA.
Yeah.
But so it's business as usual, basically.
And I know we're at time, but if I may add just a couple of points to that, please, James. I would say you touched on, I think, the biggest challenges as it relates to home charging, because you're thinking about a commercial use in somebody's residence, and so the driver policy becomes really important. To Rebecca's point, the CRA and the IRS have not put out good guidance on changes to tax bend policy, and so what we've seen is pretty consistent use of what the existing policy was. But in all cases, when we're talking about readiness, one of the key areas of readiness is that updated driver policy, and making sure that organizations are thinking about, and whether it's you've got to be with the organization for 12 months or 24 months or 36 months without needing to repay that charger. From a maintenance perspective, home chargers are relatively straightforward. It probably costs more to try to maintain them after a warranty period than to just replace the charger itself. And so we haven't gone through that cycle yet. Everything's still kind of in warranty period, given the newness. but I would anticipate that there's going to be less of a propensity to try to maintain or identify issues post the warranty period versus just replacing the charger.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, everyone here. We really appreciate you being here and listening to Rebecca and Avninder. We see this as such a wonderful success story, and we really wanted to share it with you today. So thank you very much for coming, and thank you to Rebecca and Avninder.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.